A spatial constraint is often temporary, but a dense environmental constraint can lock an aircraft away for half a century. When a heavy multi-engine bomber disappears from a designated flight plan, search crews depend on visible disruption below. Burned foliage, shattered timber, and scattered aluminum catching ambient light against the natural geometry of the landscape. This is the operational reality surrounding the B-24 Liberator known as Beautiful Betsy, carrying the serial number 42-40387. For 49 years, this aircraft and the 8 personnel aboard remained unlocated despite search efforts and later search attempts. The primary investigative objective was to positively confirm the identity of the wreckage and recover the missing men, but achieving this required overcoming a nearly impenetrable natural boundary. The operational loss occurred late in the Second World War. On February 26, 1945, the Liberator departed from Fenton Airfield near Darwin on a routine route toward Eagle Farm Field near Brisbane. This was no longer a combat aircraft. The heavy bomber had been retired from frontline strike operations and converted into a logistical transport platform, executing what was procedurally termed a fat cat run. It carried 6 United States Army Air Force's crew members and 2 Royal Air Force personnel. Somewhere along the long transit across the continent, the flight failed to arrive at its destination. The initial aerial search grids covered massive swaths of territory, but they produced no confirmed crash corridor. The aircraft went down in the Kroombit Tops, a rugged and elevated plateau in Australia defined by steep escarpments and dense subtropical blackbutt forest. The thick vegetation was not merely an obstacle to ground movement, it formed an optical shield from above, a canopy masking effect in which observers lose any clear line of sight beneath the forest roof. In a thick, layered forest, wreckage can disappear under branches, leaves, smoke-darkened scrub, and uneven ground. From an observation altitude of a few thousand feet, the visual field may appear unbroken. Aerial search platforms rely on direct line of sight to detect the metallic glint of aluminum or the unnatural geometry of manufactured aircraft components. Dense canopy and rugged terrain can defeat both, breaking the downward optical sightlines and preventing observers from seeing what is lying on the forest floor below. For the missing Liberator, this canopy masking created a perfect visual blackout. An aircraft of massive scale was effectively erased from the search map. The searchers in 1945 were limited by visual search methods over a thick, rugged landscape. Without a visible entry corridor or a sustained smoke column, the entire Kroombit Tops plateau became a permanent blind spot. That blind spot held from the 1945 searches until the 1994 discovery. Positive confirmation could not begin until the biological screen opened enough for sunlight to reach the debris and return a signal to an observer. How does an aircraft of this scale remain entirely invisible to decades of aerial search patterns? The impact geometry can be read only as far as the surviving physical record allows. The bomber struck a hillside in what is now Kroombit Tops and broke into a scattered debris field rather than remaining a single intact aircraft. Contemporary reporting described part of the cockpit about 50 meters from the tail section. Those observations point to a violent hillside collision, but they do not allow every detail of the descent angle to be stated with certainty. This specific geometry forces the aircraft into a process of kinetic disassembly. When a heavy multi-engine airframe strikes a rising surface, the lighter aluminum skin and bulkheads absorb the initial deceleration and crush instantly at the primary point of contact. However, dense and compact masses like the power plants retain massive forward momentum. The extreme kinetic energy shears these heavy components away from their structural mounts, throwing them forward along the vector of travel while the main fuselage disintegrates behind them. In this event, the crash produced a scattered structural footprint rather than a recoverable intact bomber. The confirmed evidence is strong enough to describe a high-energy hillside impact in a debris field spread across the slope. Beyond that, the component-by-component movement of the wreckage should be treated with caution. The consequence is still clear. The aircraft was fragmented across a difficult natural landscape, making the site hard to read and hard to manage. For any conventional recovery operation, this wide geometry presents an immediate logistical and procedural barrier. Gathering the shattered airframe would mandate the use of heavy lifting equipment, extensive cutting plans, sling loads, and significant disruption to the surrounding terrain. Moving heavy engine blocks and extracting tangled wing spars requires industrialized clearing. However, the operational reality of this location strictly prohibits any physical extraction or structural disturbance. The wreckage is now managed as a protected war grave and memorial site within the national park. Queensland Parks directs visitors to treat the crash site with respect and to leave it as they found it. That management approach creates a strong practical boundary against souvenir removal, casual disturbance, and unnecessary handling of the wreckage. The surviving airframe remains in situ as part of the memorial landscape. Investigators and site managers therefore work around the wreckage rather than treating it as salvage. With the structure permanently shattered and legally locked in place, what mechanism could finally break the canopy's hold? Visual revelation of an overgrown wreckage site can depend on crossing a specific environmental threshold, when vegetation is cleared just enough for a historical debris field to catch the eye. On August 2, 1994, that threshold was crossed at Kroombit Tops. The sudden detection did not originate from a dedicated aviation search operation or the deployment of advanced ground-penetrating sensors. It came during a routine park operation. Ranger Mark Rowe was checking the results of a controlled burn-off when, from an escarpment, he saw something glinting in the sunlight about 800 meters to the north. The scattered bomber had not moved. The burn-off changed the vegetation and the line of sight just enough for sunlight and observation to reach material that had been hidden for decades. While crossing this threshold solved a massive temporal gap, it immediately generated a critical operational hazard. An exposed historical wreck instantly becomes vulnerable to uncontrolled interference. On a remote plateau with rugged topography and no direct road infrastructure, authorities could not quickly deploy fencing, guards, or heavy site protection. At the same time, the bomber's historical value made it a target for souvenir hunters seeking instruments, identification plates, and personal effects, any of which could destroy archaeological context before a forensic search began. Faced with the difficulty of physically locking down a remote crash site, authorities used a simpler administrative control. By withholding the precise location while the search was being completed, authorities turned the dense forest and steep country into temporary protection against souvenir hunting and uncontrolled interference. With exposure contained, investigators could prepare the hillside search around the actual wreckage grid rather than around public disclosure of coordinates. But the core investigative requirement remained completely unfulfilled. The authorities knew a significant aviation loss had been located, yet they still needed to verify the precise serial number and systematically process the blast zone for the missing personnel. Those restrictions pushed the next phase toward controlled search rather than structural disturbance. Once the site was secured, how could investigators identify the crew without disturbing the fragile, protected airframe? Isolating delicate identity markers inside a chaotic heavy debris field presents an immediate evidence contradiction. The investigators need to find microscopic proof of identity within a macro-scale disaster zone. The main fuselage debris zone consisted of shattered aluminum bulkheads, crushed flight deck instrumentation, and twisted longerons. This central area contained the highest concentration of coherent evidence, representing the exact location where the forward crew compartment came to rest. Because the heavy fuselage panels were locked together by the impact forces, they formed complex pockets and voids where vital evidence could be trapped. The evidence, therefore, had to come from the smallest recoverable objects trapped inside the collapse. The plateau's remoteness made the work slow by necessity, and the joint United States Army and Australian military team had to recover remains and identity markers without breaking the site apart. The solution was a controlled grid search, replacing industrial extraction with measured sections, recorded fine locations, and careful separation of remains and personal effects from the surrounding debris. This careful recovery effort yielded the required primary anchor proof. Within the crash site, investigators recovered remains and personal effects, including dog tags, ID bracelets, rings, coins, and other small items. Later summaries also noted what appeared to be a wedding ring among the identifying effects. These items connected the site directly to the crew and passengers. Finding these identity markers resolved the core survey objective by tying the recovered names to the historical flight manifest and confirming the crew associated with the wreckage. The human toll was verified, allowing the individuals to be removed from the wreckage for repatriation and honorable burial. While the identities were verified, what could the outlying structure reveal about the final seconds of flight? Analyzing structural wreckage frequently reveals a stark trade-off between what can be mechanically verified and what is permanently obscured. For this specific heavy bomber, the physical evidence provides absolute proof that mechanical power existed at the moment of impact, but the total obliteration of the forward fuselage blocks any analysis of the flight controls. Investigators examining a highly fragmented site must look beyond the central impact crater to understand the final seconds of flight. They must read the detached evidence scattered across the surrounding environment. The kinetic forces of the crash distributed two critical sets of detached evidence across the mountainside. The first set consists of the distinctive twin tail section. This lightweight structure severed immediately upon the initial ground contact and remained relatively intact further downslope. The second set consists of the four heavy radial engines. These massive components came to rest away from the central wreckage, giving investigators a separate mechanical evidence set. By mapping the exact spatial relationship between the severed tail below and the four detached engines above, investigators could confidently reconstruct the aircraft trajectory. This spread geometry confirmed the kinematic impact angle, proving the bomber struck the incline while maintaining a shallow, high-speed forward trajectory. Locating the four detached engines provided investigators with the opportunity to interrogate the mechanical status of the aircraft. When an aircraft strikes terrain, the condition of the propeller blades serves as a direct indicator of engine power. This diagnostic method relies on propeller strike geometry. If an engine is dead and the propeller is stationary at the moment of impact, the blades will typically bend backward in a uniform, symmetrical pattern due to the blunt force of the crash. However, if the engine is operating under high power, the rotational energy combined with the forward momentum of the aircraft causes the blades to strike the earth at high velocity. This dynamic interaction creates distinctive torsional twisting, deep leading edge gouges, and asymmetrical curling along the length of the blades. When investigators examined the wreckage, the propeller damage provided an important but limited clue. Contemporary reporting stated that the damage suggested the propellers had been spinning at the time of the accident. That was a positive knowledge gain, but it should be read narrowly. It supports rotation at impact. It does not establish the exact power output of every engine. This physical evidence narrows the investigative focus, but it does not close it. It makes a simple picture of motionless propellers at impact less likely, yet it does not by itself eliminate every possible power, fuel, weather, navigation, or control scenario that may have developed before the final seconds. The bomber struck the terrain with propellers apparently rotating, but the exact initiating cause remained beyond the surviving evidence. Even evidence of propeller rotation only sharpened the unresolved question of why the aircraft descended into the hillside. That question requires reliable evidence from the flight deck, the crew's decisions, the aircraft's configuration, and any possible control or navigation problem. In this case, the surviving public record does not preserve enough cockpit detail to establish pilot inputs, instrument readings, or control positions with certainty. The destroyed forward fuselage therefore sets the final proof ceiling. Detached evidence can indicate motion at impact, but it cannot recover the cockpit decisions, instrument readings, control positions, or initiating cause. With the limit of proof reached, what is the final operational status of the site? Securing a historical debris field requires transitioning from temporary operational control to permanent legal stewardship over a timeline spanning decades. From the moment the initial information blackout ended in 1994 to the present day, the Kroombit Tops location demanded a rigid, long-term management strategy. The immediate recovery phase successfully extracted the critical biological evidence, but the heavy aluminum structure remained embedded in the landscape. Authorities faced the complex operational challenge of transitioning an active forensic investigation zone into a permanently monitored public environment without degrading the remaining evidence. The governing framework applied to the wreckage is best described as in situ memorialization. Under this approach, the remaining structural components are left where they fell, and the crash site is treated as a war grave and open-air memorial rather than as salvage. Queensland Parks identifies the site as the final resting place of Beautiful Betsy, and directs visitors to respect the wreckage. Implementing this preservation policy on a remote subtropical plateau requires a calculated balance between public access and site preservation. Once the formal recovery operations concluded, the area became accessible to civilian visitors through a controlled walking route. Queensland Parks describes the WWII Bomber Walk as a 3.2-kilometer return walk from the wall day use area, accessible by high-clearance four-wheel drive vehicle in dry conditions only. At the crash site, wayside signs provide interpretation about the war grave. The access design channels visitors toward interpretation rather than souvenir hunting. The present management condition remains one of regulated in situ preservation, with the wreckage protected from mechanized lifting, structural relocation, and casual disturbance, while the plateau continues to shape the site naturally. When evaluated against the strict constraints of the environment and the law, the management of this location represents a total procedural success. The declared survey objectives were systematically achieved across all phases of the operation. The forensic team secured the site, confirmed the aircraft, recovered remains and personal effects tied to the men on board, and enabled a collective burial at Arlington National Cemetery on September 29, 1995, in Section 34, Collective Grave 2084. Simultaneously, the permanent heritage protection objective was fully realized. Authorities completed the transition from hidden environmental anomaly to forensic grid and protected war grave. The debris field was documented, the human cost was addressed, and the remaining wreckage was secured under continuing legal stewardship.